class to Bubbles, Panics, and Depressions, weeks 13 and weeks 14. Hey, we're almost done. The semester is nearly over, and I have to say I've really enjoyed teaching this class. I think it's been a lot of fun. Hopefully, you've learned a little bit about worldwide economic crises, and you have kind of a basis for understanding economic crises which will happen in the future. Because if there's one truth that you can take to the bank, it's that there will always be another economic crisis somewhere in the world soon. And so we're going to talk today about some contemporary economic crises, some that are still ongoing today. And top on that list is the European debt crisis, which began in 2010 and has actually improved a bit since then. But in 2009, 2010, there was a very serious crisis. And the truth is that Europeans didn't know if the EU, the European Union, would actually stay afloat in 2010. There were questions about whether or not the EU would actually last, whether or not the euro as a currency would actually last. So if you go to Europe, the cool thing about Europe, at least from my point of view, is when you travel in Europe, you can use one currency, and it's the same currency throughout almost all of Europe. And that to me is very cool because you don't have to change money when you're going from one country to the next, and it makes it easier in a lot of ways. It's easier to travel between countries in Europe because of the EU. So let's talk for a moment about the EU before we get into the debt crisis. So the EU was this post-war concept of a Europe where there wouldn't be war, where there wouldn't be these rivalries that disseminated Europe in the first half of the 20th century. Instead, there would be a Europe that would be united. And so there was a concept, there was a cultural concept of a united Europe, a political concept of a united Europe, and an economic concept of a united Europe. And and it took a long time. It took about 30 years to put all of these together. But in the end, Europe developed a union. It's an incomplete union. Not all European nations belong to it. Not all European nations use the euro. But it's probably, since the crisis of 2010, I would suggest that the European Union has actually become stronger because the Europeans realize that they are only as strong as their weakest member now. They finally understand that. One of the dangers of an economic union is that uh, the the vulnerable parts of the union, the vulnerable countries in this union, will, if they get into trouble, they will pull down the wealthier countries. So it's quite true that you're only as strong as your weakest link, and so so this union took place. The euro was established to much fanfare, and there was some economic integration. It wasn't ever as complete as kind of the visionaries wanted it to be, nor was political integration as complete. So you have a European Union today that has some control, but not complete control. It's not a United States of Europe, as the podcast talks about. It's, by the way, I recommend the podcast on National Public Radio. That's a part of our course website. So for about 10 years, the European Union, after the integrated currency, became very successful. Benefited from the strong economic growth and the strong export markets that Germany had. Germany was the lead partner, still is the lead partner of the European Union. Benefited from internal trade. Internal trade barriers within Europe fell down. And so, in general, this was a very prosperous time for Europe. And then the 2008 Great Recession happened. And in the United States, what we saw is that the Bush administration bailed out banks. The Obama administration did a stimulus. Altogether, that was about 1.4, $1.5 trillion worth of money that was placed back in the economy to replace what had been lost. But Europeans looked at this and they said, you know, we haven't had any of these problems because we belong to the EU, and the EU protected us from this kind of excessive risk in the banking system, in the American banking system, and this kind of out of control, no regulations. The Europeans kind of scoffed at Americans in the 2008 and 2009. By 2010, it became clear that the Great Recession had impacted Europe's economy, and especially those economies on the periphery of Europe, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, to the point where their economic growth, because it was a worldwide recession, and their economic growth was nil or it was negative, and they couldn't keep up their debt payments. And so it became the European debt crisis. Okay, this is why they call it the European debt crisis, because it's all about debt, 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 debt. Keep that in mind when you answer the discussion questions this week. Okay, so what's all this about debt? Okay, so the EU had certain standards, pardon me, by which the nations that were going to join the European Union, they had to have a certain cap on their debt and on their deficit and their debt to GDP ratios. Okay, very important numbers. And what that means is, in terms of debt, that's the total amount of debt, and then the deficit is the annual deficit. Um, and so those two figures were used, and you can actually see those two figures on on the slides, the PowerPoint slides that I put on Blackboard. So be sure to look at those. Those are very useful telling slides, because when you look at them, none of the European countries in 2009 actually fit into the standards that the European Union had set up to require from member nations in terms of its debt. And so so you had a widespread debt problem in Europe. And so, okay, so back to Greece. Let's talk about Greece for a second. So this whole thing starts with Greece. Why is Greece such a problem? Well, Greece is a problem because when Greece applied to enter the European Union, they were given the same standards as everyone else. You can't enter the Union unless your debt and your deficits are down to a certain point. And Greece wasn't there, quite frankly. They weren't even close. So how are they going to do this? Well, they did this by essentially lying about their debt. They sent in false statistics to the European Union offices in Brussels, and the Brussels officials didn't look too carefully at it and bought it, and voila, Greece entered the European Union with an economy that was booming in the early 2000s, but an economy with tremendous amounts of debt and tremendous economic drags on it. The government was very inefficient. There were lots of taxes that simply went unpaid. Workers retired at 50 or 55, so it was an inefficient economy. You got a tax exemption if you built a pool. That's crazy. It's nonsense. But nonetheless, that's how the Greek government was trying to mollify the middle class, and they gave lots of tax benefits, and therefore their debts began to spike upward, and they weren't able to collect much in taxes, and so by 2009, Greece has 130% debt. That's 130% of its GDP. Okay, that's pretty high. You remember Japan's debt is still today at about 170% of GDP, but more on that later. By 2012, after the Greek economy had contracted tremendously because of the debt crisis and because of the depression that hit Greece in 2010, 2011, then that debt percentage is up to 177%, even higher than Japan. And significantly, the vast majority of that debt is held by foreigners, not by Greek citizens, almost all of it. And so that's the difference between Japan and Greece. Japan is still a very productive economy, and they really don't have to worry that much about the debt as long as it's held by their own citizens, and their own citizens have faith in their government. The opposite is true in Greece. The citizens lost faith in the Greek government. The debt was foreign held. And so what happens is that the Greek economy plummets, and all of a sudden, this is in 2009, 2010, and all of a sudden, other European economists and leaders realize that because Greece is a part of the European Union and they use the euro, that the Greek debt could actually plunge all of them into a recession or a depression. The reason why this is the case is because the Greek debt was held by banks elsewhere. It was held by banks in Spain, banks in Portugal, banks in France, banks in Germany. And all of a sudden, if the banks in Germany don't get paid back, because Greece, quite frankly, was considering defaulting on its debt at this point, if the banks in Germany don't get paid, then all of a sudden the banks in Germany are in big trouble. And this is how all of Europe became linked together, is through its financial system and through the borrowing that was done throughout the EU. Okay, so what happens is the EU decides, okay, we're in big trouble. And it's not just Greece, it's all of us. And we have to step in. And so they step in, they offer Greece a very large bailout package. And the banks actually accept what's called a haircut. I think uh, what this means is they accepted a lower return on the debts that they were owed. I think it was 75% of the debts. The EU decided, okay, and the banks accepted that 75% of those debts would get paid back. The other 25% the banks would simply have to write off. And so the European debt crisis really was saved from being a catastrophe by the European Union deciding to put lots of money into Greece to essentially save the economy at that point. So Greece had several years. They had from about 2009 to 2013. They really had serious economic problems. The unemployment rate skyrocketed. They began to have youth crime problems. The neo-Nazis in Greece became very strong. It was very worrying. It looked like Greece was going to go the way of maybe, pre-war Germany or something, and become very fascist and, a dangerous, a dangerous nation. It didn't happen. The good news is that the Greek economy is beginning to recover, and the overall European economy is beginning to recover. Now, let's talk for a moment about the slides, because it's a segue into the rest of Europe. When you look at the PowerPoint slides for this week's uh, uh, Blackboard page, those PowerPoint slides tell a story. They tell a story of a Europe overall that had very high debt levels in 2009. But by 2012, because of the anxiety caused by the crisis, European debt levels had actually declined some, and that's good news. Now, they're still very high debt levels, but one can live with a certain amount of debt, just like we do in the United States. They were able to get some of those debt levels down to, the 100% range, 110% range. The best economies were in the 60 to 80% range. And so Europe began to improve itself. Now, one of the things that happens when you have very high debt levels and your economy looks shaky is that bondholders are going to they're not going to buy your bonds unless you offer a very, very high interest rate. And so what happens in Greece is during their debt crisis, they have to offer interest rates that are way above, the 2 or 3% that you get in the U.S. Actually, even lower. They had to offer over 20% on their debt in order for anybody to buy it. The problem is that when the sovereign debt, when the bonds that are sold, when the rates on those bonds go up, then no one wants to buy those bonds. I mean, the rates have to go up so somebody will buy them, but uh, places like Greece and Portugal and Spain for a while had difficulty actually raising money. The government had difficulty raising money on the open markets because they had such shaky economies that no one wanted to buy in that debt, because the problem is they might not get the money back. Okay, so you have that issue. So you have the interest rates issue. Now, uh, the other issue that you have there is that the Greeks were, they were very unsuccessful in this, and the rest of Europe was more successful in getting their debt down. Um, but there's still some problems in the European economy. Greece is still an issue. I mean, you can see with one of the slides that the average ratio is lower for Europe and still much higher for Greece. And so just have a quick look at those slides, and that should interest you. So where's Europe at today? They have reduced the amount of debt. Uh, there have been a variety of different approaches. One of the things that's absolutely true is that the Germans have argued for fiscal austerity, and because Germany is the largest economy in Europe, then the Germans prevailed. And mostly what happened was these peripheral economies like Greece and Portugal and Spain and Ireland, those economies had to do severe budget cuts. Their unemployment went up because they were cutting the budget, and there was this really, I think the recessions or even depressions that they had were made worse because the Germans actually required these austerity measures, because the Germans did not want to see a spiraling inflation crisis coming out of this debt crisis, which, the temptation, of course, is to print more money. If you don't have enough money, you simply print more money. This is what the Germans did in the 1920s. So Germany has this history that makes them very afraid of inflation. So the Germans really imposed new rules on Europe and the European Union. Now, the European Central Bank probably could have made a much bigger difference in solving this crisis earlier. But so the austerity measures actually dampened economic growth and made things worse in Europe in the short term. And then England actually decided to pursue its own very strong austerity measures, cut the budget, and of course then unemployment went way up, and their economy deflated somewhat in the years 2010 to 2013. They're doing a little better now, but so austerity measures could work to get budget deficits down, but they also had the impact of reducing economic growth. In fact, making it into negative economic growth. And so in recent years, in 2013, 2014, then the rest of Europe, especially these peripheral economies, have said, we've had enough of austerity measures, and new governments are coming to power in those countries that say, no, we're through the worst. We're going to spend some more now, and we're not going to just go with austerity. And now back to the European Bank. The European Bank did do some bond buying, some limited bond buying in 2011, 2012. You can see this in one of the PowerPoint slides. But it wasn't enough. Remember, the United States Federal Reserve did government bond buying for 4 years, maybe even longer, probably longer than that, 4 or 5 years. They actually continued to buy American bonds to drive down interest rates and keep interest rates at rock bottom. They stuck a lot of money into the American economy, and this situation is called monetary policy. This actually worked in the U.S. Europeans didn't do enough of this, but they're doing more of it now. And what has happened is the European Central Bank has been strengthened out of this crisis because the Europeans recognize that they need a strong central bank if they're going to have a strongly integrated economy across these nations of Europe. So that's a good thing, I think. The European Central Bank will play a primary role in economic stimulus and in economic control in the future in the European economy. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and that's the end of class. So, folks, have a good Thanksgiving and a good winter break.